Let's begin with a short prayer. Father, we ask your blessings of peace on the Mideast and your help to bring forward people who can negotiate something that will be of meaning to either side. And we also bring before you India, that is really succumbing to the pandemic today. These two petitions we place before you in confidence, Lord. Hear us and answer us in the name of Jesus, your Son, our Lord. Okay, we mentioned last week as we were closing that at this point in history, one of the things that began to happen was there were books began to be published on the method for celebrating baptism, ordination, whatever. Something to know about these books, they were very peculiar to communities, and each community sort of developed its own, but they passed these books around to one another, and so the books tended to begin to influence one another. An example of that would be, that we know from the scriptures, is that Paul would write a letter to the Corinthians, but after the Corinthians read it, they would pass it around to different communities. So that's what was happening with these. And I guess if I were to think of an analogy in our own life, I remember we used to have a huge department store in San Diego, just massive. It was almost like a modern warehouse. And the entire outside, as you went around, were very large windows. And each window was an entire room set up with everything from ashtrays to the lamps. The whole thing was set up completely, and it would be a bedroom, a living room, something like that. And what would happen is people would go through there. My mother used to love to go there. But people would go through there and they'd decide, you know, I have a table like that, but I never thought of a lamp like that. So then they end up with that lamp. And over a period of time, people were influenced by what they saw in other places, and lots of people do this. As you travel around, you see things in places and they work, and that was happening with regards to the liturgy at this time. Now, while these instructions were not followed universally, remember the sort of suggestions that people see, they work, they aren't law. They do give us an insight into the effort that the church felt with to establish common patterns of worship. And this was spreading through the entire church. People wanted sort of common things of worship. I'll give you an example. One community, you could well have a teaching by the priest before you ever started the liturgy. And that would be reflective of the way the synagogue services were. You used to go to the synagogue service and then celebrate the Eucharist. In another community, they would have the sermon as we do today, right after the readings. There would be an explanation of the readings. Another community, after the whole service is over, people would sit down. Remember, they eat as part of it, so they'd all sit down after they ate, and someone would give a teaching. So the different areas began to standardize this in their own way. But the real thing that was important at this time was that common patterns of worship were beginning to be established by what they saw good in one another. They were putting it together, and it was gradually being standardized. Eventually, these books of instructions would merge. So you'd have a book of instructions, and someone would do a book of different kinds of prayers, and that would merge, and they would say, like you pour the water of baptism while saying these words. You say these words to bless the baptismal water, and so they'd go through a list of prayers, and they would be in one book, but another book telling you the structure of baptism. First thing happened, these merged. So you had that all put together and like how to celebrate baptism. But the next thing that happened is these books began to be used as a way to celebrate the liturgy, particularly in training young people. Now, I want you to realize this is a dramatic change. It's the move away from spontaneity, so that before this point, you would have a minister, and he would know that when you're celebrating the Eucharist, you pray for the Holy Spirit. May the Spirit come upon these gifts so that they can become for us the body and blood of the Lord Jesus, okay? But at this time, a prayer was written, and he wouldn't spend a spontaneous prayer. He would read the prayer, and the prayer would be standardized everywhere. Understand, these books were never meant to end improvisation, but only to safeguard the traditional patterns of improvisation, so that they really were not intended that you should read the prayer. What was intended was that you get the idea. Right after Vatican II, books began to be published like that. So at the beginning of the Mass, you'd have an opening prayer, and below it, in red, would be written, or in similar words, so that you had the ability, to do that. That's disappeared now. Until the dawn of Christianity, the scroll was the ordinary form which a book would take. And although Christians did not invent the codex, a book is a body of information. A codex is what you and I call a book, and a scroll is another thing. So you'd have a book on a scroll or a book on a codex, okay? So it could be either one. But anyway, the codex began to come around at this time, and understand that the book was not an invention of Christians, but Christians are the ones that picked it up and made it a big deal. So from the 2nd century on, even while most people were creating scrolls still from the 2nd century on, Christians at that time were now dealing only in books. And by the 5th century, Jews as well as Christians began to turn to codex. And although they have retained, I think even up to our own day, that the Torah, the scroll of the Pentateuch, first 5 books of the Bible, is always on a scroll. It's not separate from a scroll. So they still have it that way, although they study it in their homes in a book, okay? But in the church, it's always kept in a scroll. Christian preference for the codex may have been purely functional, as a scroll can only accommodate a certain amount of material. A scroll can get unwieldy if it's large, so it only holds a certain amount of material. And what you would notice in the, I guess you would say in the Bible, like we have 2 books of Kings. And the reason we have 2 books of Kings is there's too much material for one scroll. An example in the Christian scriptures is the gospel account of Luke and the gospel account of Acts are the same book, but it's too much material for one scroll. So we have 2 scrolls. Once you begin using books and pages, it's easy to put all of that in a single a book. So that began to come on. Finally, there's the possibility that Christians wanted to have something different than the Jews. So they went into the use of the books like we have them, rather than the use of the scrolls. I'll tell you a final reason, too, is that in the early days there was a desire on the part of many to drop the Jewish scriptures and to retain just the Christian scriptures. And the church was really against that. And one of the ways of guaranteeing that didn't happen would be to put all of those into a single book. So we had as you get a Bible today, we have what we normally call the Old Testament, the Jewish scriptures, followed by the Christian scriptures. Although the 2nd and 3rd centuries saw the beginning of liturgical literature, this was not a period of books, but of great freedom and expression. So we're talking about the 2nd and 3rd centuries. The books were coming in, but people were not tied to the books yet. They would slowly do that. The canon of the Christian scriptures was also being formed, and models for Eucharistic prayers emerged, as well as handbooks for community life and worship. Community life was how the community supported the church, how the church was supposed to support widows or orphans or whatever. There's a very complex thing. As a persecuted minority, Christians had to look out for one another and had to find ways of doing that to keep people safe. You had to, if you were a Christian, you could at any time of the day or night have a family arrive who the Romans were at their door burning their house down, and they came to you, and you had to be able to take care of them. So there were books on how this could be done, and these books became very, very important. Both the community and the building came to be called the church. Now remember, before this point, we talked about we were in the domestic church, so that when Mass was celebrated, we would go to someone's home and celebrate it in the home. And now they're beginning to build buildings that are churches. When the Mass was in the home, the term church never referred to a building. The term church only referred to the gathering of people. The people were the church. But once we built the buildings, then the building came to be called the church. Now, this time, both the church and the building will be called church. But over a period of time, like in our own day, when I say church, people automatically think of a building. That the word has completely moved to the other side. And the word that we call gospel came to be called the gospel as the spoken word had always been. So when the recitation of the gospel or the reading of the gospel, that was always called gospel. But this is the first time that's applied to the written text. The written text is now called gospel, and that will stick as well. The development of specific and distinctive spaces, music, and books for the Christian community is also reflected in the development of specific vessels. I think I've mentioned this before about this period, but what we call the persecution, the big Roman persecution, was sporadic, and you could be in an area of the world where you would not see the persecution at all. And the further you got from the city of Rome, the less you really saw it. And the result of that was that long before Constantine gave freedom to the church, there were large church buildings in many cities around the world. And that's where the word church came to be applied to them. You wouldn't find that in the city of Rome at this point, but they began in that area. And as that began to develop, then they began to develop very specific vessels. Later on in this study, I think probably around the time of the Reformation, you'll notice, like if you looked at a Catholic chalice was a bowl, and it had a stem, had a node in the middle, and then had a base. And they're kind of tall and not too big. And the reason there's a node in the middle, incidentally, in the early days when you said Mass, you held your two fingers together, so you had to pick it up like this. So there had to be a way to make sure you could hold it. So anyway, that became the chalice. As soon as the Reformation starts, the Lutherans take a chalice shape that is like this. And then at the bottom, there's a very short stem and a circular base, okay? But their chalices are much larger than ours because they shared the cup. We didn't at that time. Just the priest received from the cup. But you can look at a chalice from that period and tell whether it's Lutheran or Catholic. It's really kind of curious. And what we watch now is that these vessels began to develop, to be specific. From this period on, there is present in writing and in art specific evidence of Christian vessels for the bread and the wine, and they actually began to become standardized too. These were the vessels to be found in any large home of that period. So if you would go into a wealthy home, they would have a special goblet. You know, normally a Jewish home, you'd have a special goblet for Passover, okay? And you have a plate for Passover. Well, at this point, if you were a wealthy Christian, you set aside one of your special cups, let's say at a dinner set of some kind, one of your special cups and one of your plates, and those came to be used only for Eucharist. Although they were a regular standard make, they came to be used only for Eucharist. And these will then become specific vessels. In the homes of the time, the chosen container for bread was usually a homemade basket. Bread was kept in a basket. One of the things, when you study about bread, when bread is made in a loaf, and you have a solid loaf, bread will keep a very long time. It's when it's sliced open that then mold and stuff can get into it. But bread will keep a long time. But one of the things that's good for bread in that situation is that it has air circulating around the outside of it. And so they tended to keep bread in baskets. And the Eucharistic Eucharist then was also used in the basket. And they had the same bread as they used at home. The Eucharist was a memorial of Jesus sharing bread and wine rather than a memory of any specific kind of bread and wine. So that, like today, when we celebrate the Eucharist, we are required to use wine that is made from grapes and does not have additives into it, okay? And we're required to use a host that's made simply out of wheat flour and water. That's all that goes into making the host, and those are very specific. At this time, they didn't have those specific rules at all. They used the bread that was in the home, and they used the wine that was in the home. This age also saw a selection of vessels for the liturgy, a matter of choosing the very best available to the community. And this would again become the specific vessels. But in the community, let's say a wealthy person could contribute a very beautiful cup and a very substantial plate. In the homes of the time, the chosen container, the bread, was, as we said, a basket. Although pottery plates and bowls were occasionally used, you would normally find the bowls and the plates used when bread was served at table, or I would say after it was sliced or the loaf was opened. But when you stored it, you normally stored it in a basket. This period also saw the widespread use of glass vessels for many things. In this period of history, one of the things that came on the scene was glass making, and it came about at this time. And glass, the weakness of glass is that it's fragile, it'll break. But the plus of glass is that glass is very, very solid and not porous like clay can be, okay? It doesn't have that kind of porousness. And yet it has all the qualities of metal, except it's fragile. And so glass became a huge thing in the Roman Empire. And where you had the sand that was made the best glass, the Romans had factories all over the world producing glass. And it was all done by hand and everything, but there's massive amounts of glass from this time. Incidentally, if you're ever in, I think the town is Corning, New York, but there's a huge museum owned by Corning. Corning is a glass company, and their art glass is called Steuben. Okay, so it's Corning is the company, and incidentally, Corning is owned by Ford. When Henry Ford was building his car, he bought all the factories that produced the elements for his cars, so that he owned all these things. So anyway, one of the things he got was the Corning glassware. But if you go into Corning, New York, the museum there will show you about almost exactly the time in history when glass began, and then what happened to it in the Roman Empire, and then went on to beautiful things. I remember about maybe 25 years ago, there was a bowl like this, a beautiful bowl. And you would swear, like when I saw it in the British Museum, you would swear that it was made about 2 weeks ago. And it had a beautiful portrait of Caesar Augustus on it, and then it was really finely worked, carved glass and everything. And some terrorist or whatever went into the museum, pushed it over, and it shattered. They put it back together and everything, so they have it there. But you realize that that piece of glass is over 2,000 years old. And yet, if you would look at it, you would not guess anything about the age. So, a directive in the way in which glass vessels should be used in the liturgy was issued in Rome in the year 217. Now understand, a directive like this is basically aimed at the Roman Church itself, probably. However, because of the significance of the Pope and Rome, that began to be seen all over the world. Another bishop of Rome donated silver patens for use in the liturgy to several churches. The paten is the plate on which the bread is. So now what we see is the Pope is doing sort of regulations about the use of the glass, and this other one is giving patens that are not just using the best plate you have in the house, but a paten that is made for this. It is to be assumed that depending on the household where the liturgy was celebrated, glass, precious metals, wood, pottery, and bone would all have been used as vessels for the Eucharist. They were not law now, so you would use these. And if we go back in time, you find they're remarkable. Like, for instance, one of the things they do is they used to take the horns of certain animals. You take the horn, many animals have a hollow horn, and the horn is hollow, and they put it on a base of some kind, and that they used as a glass. So many of them were bone, that they used as a vessel for drinking. There were small boxes that were worn around the neck to hold cosmetics, jewelry, or some precious item, and they were most probably used to carry the Eucharist to the sick at this time. There's some beautiful pieces of this. They're around the neck, they're sort of round, and they're all open like woven metal. And one of the principal things they carried in it was herbs, because of the scent of the herbs. So they would carry herbs and stuff like that in it, like lavender and stuff like that. And over a period of time, they used to begin to use those to carry the Eucharist, largely because it wouldn't attract attention, and you could just wear it on your person. It would be safe there. And there's also evidence that the acolytes would carry the Eucharist in cloth bags. While the use of wine in the Eucharist was certainly the most common experience, there is evidence that some communities use water rather than wine. Why would they do this? It could be for the poverty. It could be a very poor community. And over a period of time, in larger communities where people had the wine and everything, some people would use water in place of the wine simply as a discipline, ascetic thing. So they would stay away from the wine. In some places, it seemed to develop. Very, very few, but I would be, remiss not to mention it. Very quickly, with increasing insistence, the practice of the Eucharist without the wine began to be condemned. You had to use the wine. And with it, the people who practiced it. So if you had these services and you used water instead of wine, the community was condemned. And incidentally, this is so early in history when this takes place. The only reason we know someone was doing it is because we have the condemnations of doing it, okay? So they must have been condemning someone who was doing it. But we don't see so much evidence of it as we see the evidence of the condemnation. There seems to be some evidence that this practice was seen and dismissed as Gnostic. The Gnostics we'll see several times here. A lot of the books that date from this period and are not in the Bible, like the Gospel of Thomas and stuff like that, were regarded as Gnostic books. And what the Gnostics held was that if you were a member of the Gnostics, the higher you got in the Gnostics, the more you were told about the teachings of Jesus. So like they would say, let's say you reached level 4 in the Gnostics, and they explained to you that Jesus only drank a certain kind of wine. And then when you got to another level in the Gnostics, they explained to you that Jesus only ate wheat bread, not barley bread. And so these different things went on. The Gnostics were into secret knowledge. You had to reach a certain level to find out things. The best example of Gnostic structures today are things like the Masons and the Knights of Columbus and stuff like that, where you reach a level and they tell you certain things. It's no secret or anything today, but they go through it. But that was a very strong thing in the early church, and that's because that was the nature of pagan religions. If you got involved in the pagan religions, there were secret things you found out as you went up, which made you better than the others in the community as you were higher up, And so that was very severely condemned. The Gnostics were seen as an aberration. If I could go to a Bible teaching, this appears, I think, in the book of Ezekiel. In the book of Ezekiel, there's a vision, and God takes Ezekiel to show him the temple in the vision. And out of the side of the temple is flowing water, and the water's flowing there. And the Lord asks Ezekiel to walk across it, it's ankle deep. Then he takes him further down, it's knee deep, takes him further down, it's waist deep, and finally he can't cross it at all. But one of the teachings there is that the teachings of Christianity are the same for, like, say, Mother Teresa, as they would be for a fallen away Catholic in San Luis Obispo. The teachings are exactly the same. The thing is that to stay with the teachings, you find deeper meanings in them, okay? Now, the Gnostics maintain their new teachings all the time. That's very, very wrong. In our tradition, the idea is that these things come to have a deeper and deeper meaning over a period of time, but it's the same truth, and you just discover deeper meanings through prayer and things like that. There's some situations like baptism that called for a cup of water as well as one of milk and one of honey to be on the altar for the celebration of the Eucharist, celebrated after baptism. Now you see the obvious reference to this, because heaven is supposed to be a land of milk and honey. So we put milk and honey on the altar. It was never that the milk and honey were consecrated. They might have been blessed, but they were never consecrated. Only the bread and wine were. But there was the habit at times of putting these on the altar. There was also evidence that this practice was condemned, and by the end of this period, the domestic church there is the clear understanding that the proper celebration is bread and wine. Okay, so by the end of the 3rd century, bread and wine are the established thing. These other things that appear just sort of sideways have begun to be seen as aberrations, and they're gone. There is a very early reference to the cup at the liturgy, and it appears that it is not a reference to a chalice made for the liturgy, but that a regular cup once used for the liturgy was then set aside and would be referred to as a chalice. There were many materials, as we mentioned earlier, that would be used for the cups, and one we didn't mention earlier but could be done is onyx. They used to use onyx and alabaster to make cups too, so they could have been used for the cup. Precious metals would be increasingly used. More and more they would begin to use precious metals. And while this became more and more the norm, it did not become a requirement until sometime in the Middle Ages. Like today, a chalice must be made out of special precious metals. Because the use of a single cup to be shared by all believers was highly valued, the cup would be large, a single cup, so that it could be shared, and the size would be determined largely by the size of the community celebrating. Most probably the cups of this period, and we've uncovered a couple of them, but most probably the cups of this period would be double-handled. So it would be a cup and there'd be a handle on each side. The chalice that I have is a reconstruction of a very, very old chalice that was discovered in Ireland many, many years ago. But the chalice is, the original, I think, is over 1,000 years old. But the original has handles, 2 handles on it. And the reason that is when a cup was passed, it was easier to pass it from one handle to another and made it much easier for people to drink. I don't know how many of you remember back when we began first offering the chalice, but one of the interesting things is since we'd never done it in, several hundred years, people didn't know what they were doing. And so you'd have someone come up, and the priest wouldn't even give them the cup. He'd try and pour it in their mouth, usually down the front of whatever they were wearing. But all kinds of things went wrong. But in these days, they knew how to share cups. So they had handles on 2 sides, and it would pass like that. One of the things that is different between the Protestant community and the Catholic community is in the Protestant community, you take communion. And so when they pass the bread around, they take it and this sort of thing. That's called taking communion. In the Roman Catholic community, a deacon or a priest takes communion, but everyone else receives communion. And if you look biblically, there are texts to say you're supposed to take. We use it, take this is the chalice of my blood, take and drink, this sort of thing. So we have the thing take, and we also have the texts that say you should receive it. So there's no theological basis for either side, but that's a tradition. And so in the Catholic Church, they want a minister to hand the cup to you, not that you're passing the cup around, okay? But I think it would be easier if we had cups with 2 handles and passed them around. But whether there's a theological reason not to do that, I don't know. The main point to keep in mind is that the vessels of the Eucharist originated as domestic vessels. This period of the domestic church was a time of huge growth and a time also of diversification in the church. The reason why it's diversification is we talked about, you had the idea that you were supposed to say a blessing to call the Spirit over the, let's say, the bread and wine. Well, the Eastern world was very much more elaborate in their use of things. And so they would make gestures like the dove coming down and all kinds of things that were all very much a part of their liturgy. After the thing of Constantine, we're going to go through a period called the Germification of the church, and it's the influence of the Germans on the church. And what Germans, like Americans, are very direct. That's our language. It says it, And so a lot of that stuff disappeared from the Western church, even though it stayed in the Eastern church. But this time it was very, very diverse. People doing it in very different ways. As from the very beginning of the Christian community, there was an increasing use of sacrificial language concerning the Eucharist. So we spoke of the Eucharist primarily as a sacrifice, okay? So they would do that. But it was primarily in a spiritualized sense. Like, for instance, when I was a youngster, part of the idea of the sacrifice, in the sacrifice, a victim is destroyed, like the lamb is burned or whatever. And in the Eucharist, when we receive the Eucharist, then that's the sacrifice. The Jesus Christ is consumed. But an approach like this, it emphasized the importance of the attitude of the believer, so that the sacrifice is the attitude that I bring to this, and then how I carry that in my life when I leave. And so what the sacrifice of the Eucharist was, it was to strengthen us for a life of sacrifice in our love of people around us and that sort of thing. So that's kind of how the thing was really seen. Hippolytus is a very important man. Hippolytus wrote Eucharistic prayer. In the Missal, it's the second Eucharistic prayer, and he meant it to be an outline for people to celebrate the Eucharist, one of these early, designs of how a Eucharist was supposed to go. But for Hippolytus, the sacrifice is much less a metaphor for Christian living than it is actually a statement about the Eucharist. So what I said to you earlier about consuming the Eucharist, that's a sacrifice. Hippolytus would like that. But most people at this time would say the sacrifice is the way you live your life after you've received the Eucharist. The basic understanding at this time was the baraka spirituality of the Jewish community. Baraka is a prayer of thanksgiving, and this is woven into the Passover. Like the Passover, as you know, is a celebration of the leaving of Egypt, and so it's basically a thanksgiving. And though we ask God for things and this sort of stuff, the prayer is, at its understanding, is basically a thanksgiving. And the earlier Eucharist was that way. But the basic understanding was a baraka. And the idea of thanksgiving was slowly overtaking any idea of blessing. So initially it seems as though it was kind of blessing, but in the Jewish thing of this actually being a thanksgiving. And I should mention to you that the word Eucharist is the Greek word for thanksgiving. And so that became modeled into this too. This period also sees an increased interest in viewing the Eucharist in the language of thanksgiving for the covenant that is revealed in the death and resurrection of Jesus. So, like in the Jewish tradition, the baraka of the Passover is a thanksgiving for the deliverance from Egypt. In the Christian thing, the baraka of the Eucharist is exactly a thanksgiving for the deliberation from death, where Jesus was delivered in the resurrection, and we're delivered through that. And in this way, the Eucharist became a living memorial to the resurrection of Jesus. And as a result, this leads to a big emphasis on the Last Supper as the touchstone for this memorial. Now remember, up to this point, the touchstone for the Eucharistic memorial was the Passover dinner. Now the Last Supper itself begins to have a greater and greater influence. When I was a youngster, it was very common when a priest was ordained to have a picture on the holy card that showed a table much like Da Vinci's Last Supper, except that Jesus was wearing the vestments of a priest. And you'd see a host and you'd see a chalice on the thing. Now, that was unknown originally, but at this time, it begins to see more and more reference to the Last Supper. The Eucharist also becomes the focal point for reconciling believers who have committed serious sin. This period, if you were involved in serious sin, incidentally, curiously, at this time, they seem to only have regarded three things as serious. An apostasy is denying your faith, okay? And apostasy, like for instance, a lot of people think that teenagers who fall away from the faith or something are guilty of apostasy, but that's not really true. You have to really make a commitment to the faith on your own in the first place. And then after that, if I deny the belief that I actually hold, that is apostasy. But if somehow I'd be convinced that it isn't true, that's not apostasy. Apostasy is when you take a position contrary to what you actually believe. The second thing they regarded as sin was murder, and the third was adultery. But anyone who was guilty of one of these three things, and apostasy, like when a persecution was going on, a lot of people would deny their faith rather than be killed. And when the persecution was over, then they would want to come back to the community. And in the case of murder and adultery, these would be things that would be known pretty publicly when they took place. And so the way these people, they were automatically had to stop receiving communion, which is where we get the word excommunicate, away from communion. So they were away from communion. But forgiveness, whereas we would see forgiveness in the sacrament of reconciliation, they really saw their forgiveness when they were readmitted to communion. Now, did they have the sacrament of reconciliation? Did they confess their sins? Yes. But like, for instance, when I go to the sacrament of reconciliation and the priest gives absolution, I feel forgiven. At this time, you would feel forgiven when you got communion after the confession. And so this became a way of bringing people back into the community. Long before reconciliation developed as a specific ritual. At this time, it wasn't really a ritual. We know from the scriptures, Jesus says, confess your sins to one another. So they would confess their sins to one another. But the ritual now is that you're alone with the priest. It's covered by confidentiality, and there's all kinds of things to it. But all those details weren't there. You would just confess your sins. You'd be readmitted to the Eucharist. And in the Eucharist, you would find your forgiveness. The second and third centuries were a period of great innovation in the understanding and thinking about the Eucharist. So in the second and third centuries, they began to sort of meditate on it. The community developed many models and images to bring about a greater understanding of the Eucharist. So that there were images presented to people. And if you're familiar, I don't know if you can see it, on the altar here is a lamb. Now the lamb was used as a sacrifice in Israel, in the temple, so the lamb became one of the symbols of Jesus. And that really mentioned the, the idea of the sacrifice. The new covenant was seen in the bread of the Eucharist, which was symbolized for them in the manna that fell for the Jews where they were in the Sinai. And even in the liturgy, we call it the bread of life. Now that comes from the title of the manna that got the Jews survived in the desert. This enabled Christians to hold to Jewish roots, remain grounded in the Hebrew Scriptures, and at the same time to distinguish themselves as Christians. Okay? So they wanted to retain their Jewish roots without being Jewish. They wanted really to be Christian, but to retain these roots. It's curious, you'll see the same thing go on during the Reformation, where they wanted to be Protestant, but retain their Catholic roots. It's kind of a strange thing. One powerful image from the Hebrew Scriptures was a story about Melchizedek. Melchizedek is one of the most interesting characters in the Scriptures, because every time we come across an important person, Abraham, Jacob, David, stuff like that, we always get their ancestry, because that's very important to bring them into the thing. Melchizedek is the only really important person we get who has no ancestry. He also appears in the Scriptures a couple times so far apart that it's hard to believe it's the same person. So Melchizedek began to have sort of a mystical understanding in the church, both among the Jews and the Christians. But there's an incident where Abraham does a raid, and he gets a lot of things, retains a lot of stuff that he gets from these people that he raids. And when he's coming back from the raid, he encounters Melchizedek. And when he sees Melchizedek, what he does is give Melchizedek 1/10 of everything he got. That's the tithe. That would ordinarily go to the Jewish priesthood. And Melchizedek offers him bread and wine. So this is seen as a sign or an image of the Eucharist. There were also everyday, images for the Eucharist. And I'll give you one, as I was taught as a youngster, is the Eucharist is like a vaccination against eternal death. So that if you've received the Eucharist, what you have done is receive the body of the one who has already survived death. So you will survive death. Just like when I was a youngster, the big vaccine that was invented when I was a youngster was polio. And the people who got that vaccine, I think it was made from the kidneys of monkeys or something like that. But they would infect an animal with the disease and then kill the disease or whatever in the animal. And then you'd receive the flesh of that animal. And they saw the Eucharist that way. They saw the Eucharist as an antidote to sin, that it strengthened you to prevent sin and sort of guarded it. They saw it as food for the journey, as to what you would eat and what would sustain us until we reached heaven. In the same way, manna sustained the Jews until they reached the Holy Land. And finally, they would see it as a divine gift, like what Jesus gave us when he finally ascended into heaven was this gift of the Eucharist. Okay, we'll call it there and pick it up there next week. Thank you very much.